Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Menahem Heritage Center. Many of you know me from previous sessions that you've attended, including last week's part one of this lecture series. I'm very happy to welcome you for part two of the series. I want to just personally thank the few of you that sent me kind messages asking how I was doing in quarantine. As you can see, I'm out back at the Begin Center, and both myself and my daughter survived being cooped up together for 2 weeks. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to our speaker very shortly, just to remind you how we do this here, that at the end of his presentation, he will answer questions which you can submit via the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read them out to him. But I'm very happy, of course, to welcome back with us Dr. Menahem Merhavy from the Harvey Truman Institute for the Advancement of Peace at Hebrew University. And today he's going to be talking about the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has been, I think, in the headlines and on our minds when we think about the Middle East and Israel for the past, well, certainly the past decade, probably more than that. So without further ado, I'm handing over to Dr. Merhavy. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Paul. Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here again. Today we'll talk about Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and its role in the region. This talk will be divided into three parts. As Israelis sometimes like to say, everything in the army is divided into three. So this one will be divided into three. The first part, I'll talk a little bit about some less known facts about Iran in general and the revolution in particular, the Islamic Revolution of '79. The second part, I will deal a little bit in-depth tour, so to speak, of the Islamic Republic and a little bit more about its history than you often hear on the news. And the third part will deal with its role in the region and what is the Iranian interests, and what are the Iranian interests in the region? Why is Iran involved in Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon? And this is just to name the three highlights, in Syria, of course, fourth. And these are just some of the highlights. So, so all of what I've said now will take about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for a Q&A to take it where you want to go. So let's begin. I'll take the screen now for a minute, well, for a while, and talk with you about this country, which is a little less known than maybe it should. Iran. Let's take a closer look at this country, which is, by the way, very big. It's you can put Germany, France. There's still a lot of room left in this country. But what I want to focus on is mainly the neighbors of Iran and the demographics of Iran. Okay, and we'll also see some of the interesting. We'll see towards the end of this talk how the two interact. Okay, because one of the things I want you to I will try to convince you throughout this talk is that as much as Iran is trying, it's all Iran's involvement in the region is often described as new imperialism, reviving the Persian Empire, etc. There's actually internal reasons for some of this involvement. So if we look at Iran, and we'll see some of its main neighbors, we have Saudi Arabia down here, then Iraq, Turkey, a little bit of Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan. Okay, so these are the neighbors of Iran. It's a simple, just a tour of the map of the surroundings of Iran. But if we look at the population of Iran, we'll find something quite interesting. A little less than half of Iranians are not Persians, meaning their first language is not Persian. Okay, so let's just try to make that simple. Persian is people are defined by the first language. Okay, the first language of many Iranians is Persian, but a little less than half of them actually have other languages as the first language, which pretty much points at different ethnicities. So let's look at some of the main ethnic groups we have in Iran. Down here by the Gulf, we have Arabs. Okay, this area called Khuzestan. Down here, including that area of the port that you heard about a couple of weeks ago in Israel, presumably attacked by cyber warfare. That area is actually inhabited by many, many Arabs, people of Arab origins, I should say. And up here, bordering with Iraq and Turkey, we have a large Kurdish population. When we go east from there, we have a large Azeri population, meaning people whose first language is actually a dialect of Turkish. So they're kind of Turks by their ethnicity. Without going into too many, esoteric groups down here, we have all sorts, up here we have all sorts of other ethnicities, Gilani, Mazandarani, small groups of Iranians who have, again, other dialects as first language, and in many respects would be considered, well, not exactly some of ours by other Iranians. And if we go down here to the border with Pakistan and Afghanistan, we have Sistan and Baluchistan and Luristan. That's another group. So we have 3 other ethnic groups that live on the border here. Okay, all these ethnic groups challenge the very notion of an Iranian state and the nation state in Iran by the fact that they speak a different dialect. Some of them are also Sunni, so they're also minorities in the sense of the religious, religious minority, like here, Sistan, Baluchistan. When we have the 2 minorities overlapping, we have groups that are actually quite disgruntled by the state and often feel, underprivileged by the powers that be. And we see that with occasionally violence in this area here and in this area down here. People of Arab origins, again, some of them are Sunnis, and Azeris are, by and large, feel part of the Iranian Republic, but every once in a while we have other signs of some irredentist or some ethnically motivated, I would say, uprisings or at least unrest in this area as well. So what I'm trying to say is that when Iran is looking at the region right and left, it doesn't only see its neighbors, and we'll talk about a little bit about its relations with them a little further down the road, but it also thinks about its own population. When Iran has a feud with Iraq, it doesn't only consider the people of Iraq, it also has to consider the population that it sees as some kind of a challenging and even quite dangerous population that borders with Iraq on the Iranian side. These people might be a 5th column, okay, if a war erupts with Iraq, okay? It stood to test, and actually these people were quite loyal, but there's no question that whenever the tensions between Iraq and Iran rise, these population is put between a rock and a hard place in the sense of, what are you more loyal to, your origins, your ethnic origins, or your homeland, or the country you're citizens of, et cetera, et cetera. And the same goes to this population, and well, the Kurds is actually one thing that in a way unites Iran, Iraq, and Turkey, because all 3 countries do not want to see a Kurdish, independent state. So that's one thing they all can share in a way. Just one more thing, when there's tension between Iran and Turkey, the Azeris feel that tension because Azeris actually, they share, well, this part of Iran, then we have Turkey, and we have Azerbaijan. It's another country that's inhabited by a Turkish-speaking people, okay? And that means that, it's kind of an irony that Iran's relations with Azerbaijan, another Shiite country, are actually pretty bad. Iran is actually having better relations with some of its Sunni neighbors rather than with Azerbaijan, which is a Shiite country, exactly because of that reason, that Iran sees Azerbaijan in its very existence as some kind of a threat, because this country might use or has the potential of using the fact that there's a large Azeri population in Iran to leverage, in time of conflict with itself. So there's this, I would say, inherent tension and inherent suspicion in Iran towards this country. So that's a little bit about the map to try to get an idea of this map. As you see, Iran is actually it's not exactly a federation, but it's really built of provinces that have some sort of independence or some self-rule in certain matters. Of course, not in foreign affairs, but we're talking about internal matters. Okay, I want to take you further to a very brief history of pre-revolution. So as you know, before 1979, the country was ruled by Mohammad Reza Shah, this fellow who became king actually when his father was had to abdicate in 1941 by by the Allies because he was flirting with the Germans, and that's what made this guy a king. But he was very inexperienced. He was very young. He was 19 years old at the time. And what really made him into the person that he became, which was kind of a dictator, was actually a clash with this fellow. Some of you might know from history books. This is Mohammad Mossadegh. He was prime minister in Iran. There was such a role at the time in the early 1950s. And he actually staged some kind of a coup against the Shah, kind of tried to oust him in 1952, 53. The summer of 53 was really the peak of that, when the Shah had to flee Iran, and he went to Italy for 4 days, and he came back with something that later on would become known as an operation of the MI6 and the CIA, both the American and the British agencies. And they were very concerned about Mossadegh's nationalist talk, and especially the specific kind of nationalism he was preaching, which talked about taking our own resources into our own hands. In other words, kicking out the British and American intervention from the oil industry of Iran. And that was something that brought oil prices up and got everybody very much panicked. And that's why the Americans and the British became involved. Now, once the Shah returned from this very brief coup, that's when that's when the Shah became the dictator that he would become for the next a little more than 2 decades, until he was ousted in 79. So what the Shah learned during that brief period was that in order to rule the country, he needed to have 2 things. One is an iron fist on opposition, and that's why he created an organization called Savak, which became the secret police, the notorious secret police of the Shah. They would arrest people. Sometimes people would disappear, no trials, et cetera, that sort of stuff. Soviet-like kind of control over society, I would even say. And the second thing was self-aggrandizement, or cult of the leader, okay, which the Shah led not only to himself, but to the whole royal family. Okay. Now, in the course of the 1960s and 1970s, something very interesting developed in Iran, which the Savak, as much as it was notorious for being able to reach anywhere in Iran, every group of people who would meet knew that there might be some Savak agent. Every workplace, for example, knew that there's definitely a bunch of people who report to Savak what's being said. Workplaces. Actually, the only places that were, I would say, relatively speaking, immune from Savak penetration, ironically, were the mosques. That was the one place when people would actually gather, and not everything would be reported to Savak. Okay, they were actually much better in tracking the religious, the clerics, as we call them, in the madrasas, in the learning houses. There they had a pretty tight control over what's being said and who's being spreading around bad kind of propaganda, but not in the mosques. Friday prayers were pretty immune to that. Now, during that period of the 60s and 70s, I want to give you a little bit of taste of that period with this video. Very short, but it will give you a taste of that. This is a celebration from 1971. And the place is called Persepolis. It's an archaeological site in Iran. In 1971, the Shah decided that he declared it as the year when Iran should celebrate 2,500 years to the Iranian monarchy. Okay, and it was a frenzy. It's nothing less than that. For years, actually, for a couple of years, every workplace, every school, every association you can dream of had to commemorate that event with flags, with special, all kinds of paraphernalia that they created, all kinds of memorials that they would create. Special posters had to be hung in every government office, for example, et cetera, et cetera. It's quite amazing what they did for this celebration. And the peak of that was an event that took place that extended over 5 days in that place. Persepolis was, it's a historical capital of the Achaemenid Empire from the 6th century BC. Okay, so actually just after the time of Cyrus, time of Darius the Great. And in this site, the Shah created an extravaganza. Again, the preparation took months, many, many months to prepare this. This is just one of the famous, I will lower the volume here and explain to you a little bit of what you see. So what we see are people dressed like, people from the Achaemenid period, and there's trumpets and a very big soldiers' parade that resembles the history of Iran. And the idea was, to a large extent, that embodied the idea of the Pahlavi state, as we call it, the pre-Islamic, the state that fell in 1979, that the history of Iran is one big continuum, but this continuum has a very important point. The Shah's time, the Pahlavi period, the 1970s, are actually reenactment of Iran's grandeur in its ancient times, okay, in the Achaemenid period. In other words, the Shah pretty much said, all but said outspokenly, I am a modern Cyrus. Okay, and this parade of the soldiers, another thing to give people that feeling. All great people of many great, many nations came to visit this, came to these celebrations. Actually, hundreds of dignitaries came, and tens of thousands of Iranians actually took part in this huge celebration. And I'll end it here. This is just to give you a little bit of a something from that era before I move on to what was brewing in Iran at the time. And the Shah was not so much aware of that, even though he wasn't totally unaware. So in the course of the 1970s, we see a clear tendency of intellectuals, not just clerics, okay? And here I want to define, a cleric is a person his job is, so to speak, to teach in a madrasa. It's a certain kind of career. Think of it like an academic career, okay, where you go through BA, master's, PhD, publications, professorship, hopefully. That's the kind of, career that a cleric has. And a cleric, is simply, could be simply identified by the turban on their head, basically, if you want to look at it that way. So it's a very, so that's one kind of people that were starting to become more unrestful in the course of the 1960s and 1970s. I can mention 1963 as an important point when the Shah declared the revolution of the Shah and the people, or what is often more known as the White Revolution, where he was going to march Iran towards a bright future, make it into one of the 5 most prosperous countries in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And these steps included things that were seen by clerics as all-out attack against religion. Okay, if we have time, we'll go into some of those details afterwards. But this is just the wide picture to get when did the more traditional or religious parts of society start to see the Shah as the enemy of Islam. Okay, it's 1963 is a good point in time to look at that. Okay, the White Revolution. But he wasn't just the clerics. Okay, this guy, for example, he's not, he's not any famous like so many clerics. His name is Ali Shariati, and Shariati was a preacher, but he's not a cleric. He was not really a preacher. He was actually a professor of social sciences, and he studied for years in France. And Shariati is the kind of people that brought Islam to be relevant to a whole generation of Iranians who would bring about the revolution just a couple of years after he died, even actually about a year after he died. And Shariati he was socialist in many ways, but basically his point was to tell these young Iranians, many of whom were not very religious and not even inclined to religion necessarily, that Islam is the only way to save them from that key feeling that they that he knew they were failing, and that was alienation. Alienation from what? Alienation from anything the Shah and the Pahlavi state seem to represent. From the fact that on the one hand, it is a rich country. I mean, oil prices went up in the 70s, part of the crisis in the Middle East. So Iran made a huge benefit from that. And yet more and more Iranians that were cramming into the cities lived in, kind of slums really, and in terrible conditions. The fact that alienation from the, I would say, from the lack of care for tradition, even though the Shah was not, he never said I'm an atheist or anything like that. But to give you a simple example, in 75, the rumor was that the Queen Farah Diba, it was actually more than a rumor, it was pretty true. Some diplomats were shocked by this incident where the Queen had a reception of dignitaries in the palace in the middle of Ramadan, in the middle of the day, and raising a toast with champagne. There's nothing more sacrilege you can do in a Muslim country than what I've just described. This is the epitome of rudeness and lack of respect for one's tradition. Okay. Another example is from the late 60s onwards, there was a festival in Shiraz, a summer festival in Shiraz, where they would have all kinds of avant-garde, performances that included nudity and disrespectful things. And these are some of the things that actually brought about the madrasas to erupt in a whole wave of protests that became just ever stronger as the 60s were drawing to a close. So let's take just a closer look at Shariati for a minute before I move on. Islam is the first school of social thought that recognizes the masses as the basis. Look at this Marxist language that he uses here. The fundamental and conscious factor in determining history and society. Okay, so Shariati basically tells these young Iranians. Many of you think that religion is primitive, Islam is primitive. You're correct, because the Islam, as you know, it is primitive. It's a passive Islam. It's run by traditional clerics. The Islam, when I talk about Islam, Ali Shariati, I actually have something quite different in mind. It's a very active, rebellious kind of Islam. And he actually kind of described it as black Islam. That's traditional passive Islam versus red Islam. And that is the kind of Islam that actually took to the streets and overturned the country just a few months after Shariati, who, by the way, spent a few prison terms during his lifetime, and he died mysteriously in London. He wasn't very old, actually. He was in his 50s. So that's the kind of things that, for example, would right away spread the rumor that Savak, the secret police of the Shah, was what killed him. Okay. If we look at the Islamic Revolution, we find something very interesting, and I want to do it through these two photos. So the revolution broke out in late 78, early 79. I'm skipping, the simple facts of why it happened, but basically it has to do with two, derogatory or very insulting articles in one of Iran's leading newspapers against Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini, who, by the way, had been exiled from 63 onwards, from that white revolution, declaration of the Shah onwards, because he led unrest against this white revolution. So he was exiled to spent about 15 years in Iraq after that. So these articles against Khomeini and against his son, who again died mysteriously as a young man in Iraq, but the rumor was, and again it's quite substantiated, that the Shah secret police was actually behind this. Anyway, if we look at these young ladies taken to the streets, we see that, well, these two seem to be wearing, they're wearing hijab, even niqab. One of them, this is niqab, this is a little more covering, and yet many of them are not, and they're obviously not very religious, these women, at least in their outward looking. And so are the men. You see, many of them are dressed, Shariati himself, as you saw, he's dressed like a professor in university and not as a cleric. That tells you a lot of these people that took to the streets were not very religious. Some of you might even remember from life or from posters, these kind of costume, this is kind of a uniform, really. So they're holding a picture of an Ayatollah. This is Ayatollah Khomeini in exile, of course. But these guys are not very religious. You see the mustache and this kind of hat. These are communists. And many of them were very, very active in the revolution. So how come we have that in Iran? That's something we don't often see in the Middle East or anywhere else. We have communists and religious forces taking to the streets together and bringing down a government. Well, that has to do a lot with Shariati's thought, which really went around, again, convincing and arguing for a whole generation that Islam is about social justice, and hence, if you want to fight for social justice, Islam is your cause. I want to move on to Khomeini himself. This person, one of the least understood, I think, people in the history of the modern Middle East. Okay, Ayatollah Khomeini again. So he was a cleric, all right. I mean, in terms of the education of his career, okay. But what made Khomeini special and made him stand out, and by the way, stand out also against many Ayatollahs and many men of religion, was the fact that he went all out against passivity or passiveness of the clerics. In other words, for the most part, okay, for most of Shiite history, for most of Islamic history of Shiite Islam, most clerics were against being embroiled too deeply in political affairs. Actually, some of the greatest clerics of the 20th century thought that men of religion should stay shy from politics as much as they can. They should only intervene in times of serious crisis where there's a total misunderstanding or disconnection between the ruler and the masses, and then they should do it in a very limited, role, and then they should step back and let things, evolve naturally. Okay, Khomeini stood out from this tradition, and basically he said, this is something that he realized apparently in the late 60s, early 70s. Again, it has to do with those celebrations as well, because these celebrations convinced him of two things. One, the clerics should take the lead in actually the Muslim nation's life, not just Muslims as individuals, but Muslims as a nation. And what is, a nation is basically the political, if you think of it politically in the modern age, that means a state, the nation state. So a cleric, because who else knows the masses, who knows the crowd better than the cleric, right? Their leader, their spiritual leader. That's a person they always come to when they have a problem. That's a person who tells, who gives out fatwas and, rulings in matters of life and death. So who would be better to tell them how to run their country than the cleric, okay? And that is an idea that's known as velayat al-faqih, or the rule of the jurisprudent, okay? So that is one idea. The second idea was that the problem is not the Shah himself. And that's another problem. Clerics in the past might have thought that the Shah was doing something wrong, and then they would go to the Shah and even lead a protest against the Shah specifically and tell him to correct his ways. But they would never reach the conclusion that Ayatollah Khomeini did. And that is that it's not just the Shah himself, the person of the Mohammad Reza Shah, who is the problem. The problem is really with the system. The problem is with monarchy as such. And then Khomeini came up with the idea of an Islamic Republic. If we think about this idea for a minute, it might sound like it's an oxymoron, right? Islamic Republic, Islamic means, well, you think of something from the 7th century, and then you get Republic, which is an idea that came from France. Well, it came from Rome, but from the Greeks. But to Iran, when Iranians said in the modern age, Republic, they thought of France and the French Revolution. So how come we have these two ideas, and it has to do, think about it, how that connects to the question I posed earlier about religious people and communists, or religious people and non-religious people joining hands for a joint goal, okay? So Islamic and Republic, so we have a state that's run by two parallel systems. One is Islamic, so it has Sharia law, well, with some modifications. And then we have a republic. We have a country that has a very active, I'll skip that and I'll get to the Majlis, right, the parliament, okay? A very active parliament that in many ways is almost as liberal as any Western parliament you can think of. And you have a president that's elected for 4 years, okay? And we have cabinet members who are elected by the president. Again, I'm not going into all the details of the system, but basically what you have here, okay, the large picture is that we have two parallel systems. One is non-elected, this one, and the other is the elected system. And the two have to work together in order to lead that country, okay? And that is part of the legacy of Khomeini, of the Islamic Republic, okay? That we have a country that's run, on the one hand, like every modern country, with elections to parliament, elections to presidency, and the second part is the ideals of the revolution. And these ideals are Islamic, meaning we have special place for clerics to decide what are the ideals and how do we filter the other elected system to suit the non-elected system ideals. Okay, so the non-elected is supposed to make sure that the freedom that's given to the people by the elected system doesn't go sideways. It doesn't divert from the ideals of the revolution. Okay, so I know it's kind of a complex idea what I've just presented, but there's no way of understanding what's going on in Iran in internal or external matters without understanding this duality of the elected, non-elected, the Islamic, and the Republic, okay? And if there's questions about that, I'll explain. The other, or part of the system, and the most controversial one, in terms of the system, of the legacy that Khomeini left. Khomeini, by the way, died 10 years after the revolution took place. And I'm sure many of you understand that it cannot be a coincidence that he died 10 years after the revolution, just like Muhammad died just 10 years after he started his ministry. Okay, there has to be something down there. Anyway, what Khomeini left was a role of something called the leader. Okay, it's interesting that in English, in many languages, it's translated as supreme leader, but in Persian, it's simply the leader. Okay, rahbar. And the leader is the person whose job is to make sure that the country remains true to its ideals. Okay, now, in Khomeini's time, it was built a lot on charisma of the leader. Khomeini was a very charismatic person, okay? And again, I might go into more details later, but basically that, he was a magnifying person, electrifying personality. And the person that he left to become his heir for a host of reasons was this person who is anything but charismatic. He's actually a great figure, if there's anything I could say about him. But he's a very well, I would say, very well talented politician, and that is Khomeini. Their names are quite similar, so there's sometimes confusion. Khomeini is the first leader, and Khomeini is the second leader. And what we have is, what's interesting is that the constitution that was written by Khomeini or led by Khomeini to be voted for after the revolution, and there were many, many debates and a few drafts of this constitution, put the supreme leader in the role of the arbiter, the final arbiter of matters of dispute between all the elected systems that we have in the country. Okay? And that left so much power in his hands. It was not necessarily the way things, were planned to be when the revolution went to the air. As you saw, I kind of gave you a taste. A lot of the people, and I would even bet a majority of the people who brought down the Pahlavi state in 1979, late 78 and 79, were not fond of the idea of Velayat al-Faqih, the rule of the jurisprudent, and many of them, I would even bet, didn't even have any idea of what that idea even was. Okay, it was only some circles close to Khomeini, some students of madrasas who knew him in exile and were in contact with him, that knew what Velayat al-Faqih was even all about, the rule of the jurisprudent. Another thing that Khomeini left is the Revolutionary Guards. Okay, and here I want to give it 2 minutes, 2-3 minutes, because it has to do with the last part of this talk, because we talked a little bit about pre-revolutionary Iran, about the revolution, and a little bit about the legacy of that. And then the Revolutionary Guards is really the connecting line between the legacy of the revolution and the evolution of the revolution in Iran and its involvement in the region. So what's this body called the Revolutionary Guards? I talked about duality in governorship or in the authorities in Iran. That applies also to Iran's military and police. Okay, so just like we have two elected, non-elected systems, well, in this case, it's not elected, non-elected, but just we have the normal system, the ordinary system that you have in every state, military, police, etc. And we have, side by side with that, we have the other system, that's the Revolutionary Guards. So without going into too many historical details, the Revolutionary Guards were born out of the need to bring order to the chaos that reigned in Iran in the course of the revolution itself. Think about the revolution, you know, people take to the streets, all the systems go down. It's really doomsday in every way you can dream of it. You know, stores are being shattered and people are sometimes being, you know, killed on the spot because they had a connection with the previous regime, et cetera, et cetera. Now, at some point, Khomeini understood that in order to make order in the country, he cannot let a lot of, you know, thugs and hooligans who were running around the streets with weapons to run the country. He needed, you know, order. And for that purpose, he created the Revolutionary Guards. That was historically how that body was born. The second reason, or the second important goal of the Revolutionary Guards, is to make sure that the Shah is not coming back. Believe it or not, when the revolution broke out, and even when the Shah left in January 79, no one told Khomeini that the Shah was not coming back. That had happened, I remind you, 2.5 decades earlier. Who said the CIA and the British, or maybe Israeli Mossad, would not stage some coup to bring the Shah back. And what Khomeini created is this body that would make sure that all the systems of the state are strictly and directly controlled from above by the new revolutionary system. And that's what the Revolutionary Guards is all about. So it's about making sure that the country is run by the revolutionary ideals, and it oversees all the other systems. So think of it like the kind of body that gives you security clearance for government jobs, you know, for sensitive jobs, in any kind of job. It could be infrastructure, not just security itself. So you'd have to get a clearance for the Revolutionary Guards. And they have their people in every single body of the state in Iran, okay? And they oversee, you know, so people in Iran, you know, when they, for example, you know, think of workers in a workplace, if, especially if they're government employees, if they chit-chat in the tea area, it's more often than not tea area, not coffee area. The tea area, they would, they know that their conversation might be, you know, might be somebody listening who would report it to the Revolutionary Guard, to some affiliated association of that, you know, and their, for example, their promotion might be, you know, might be stalled because they don't seem loyal enough. Okay, so that's the kind of body that was created. Revolutionary Guards later on, with years, also received the job of making sure that Iran's interests in the region and beyond are kept. Okay, and I will just give it 5 more minutes and then we'll go to Q&A. So since the Revolutionary Guards, part of their job is to secure the country. In other words, to make sure that Iran is safe. So we have the military, we have the green military, we have the blue police. They do the ordinary job that militaries and police do. But overall, I can tell you that the military in Iran is quite a weak body, because historically, you know, since the revolution, the military was known to, or was suspected of having, I would say, some loyalty or some sympathy to irreligious ideas. Okay, or it was actually the most powerful body other than Savak before the Shah came, you know, went down. So even after the revolution, even with the fact that many officers in the army were replaced, many were executed, high-ranking ones were executed by the revolutionary consuls, overall the military was still suspected as not loyal enough to the revolutionary ideals. And again, the Revolutionary Guards fill, you know, that vacuum in by having this military, okay, which it's both military, it's police. And again, just to show you how absurd it might get, Iran has 2 air forces, it has 2 navies, it has 2 intelligence corps, one of the military, one of the Revolutionary Guards. It's really like a parallel military force in every sense of the word. But it also has the last word. So if, for example, there's a problem with the loyalty of an officer in the army, the ones who would, eavesdrop on him, track him, arrest him would be the Revolutionary Guards. They have the last word about these type of things as well. I wrote the question here towards the Shiite crescent. So the idea was raised in the region some 8 years ago that Iran is trying to build some crescent from Iran through Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Gaza Strip. It makes kind of a crescent. I might refer to that in the Q&A, whether it is trying or not. But whoever, if it was, the body that would be in charge of that would be Revolutionary Guards, and specifically something known as the Quds Force. You probably have heard of them, if not before, by January of this year, when their commander Qasem Soleimani was killed in a raid by the American military. Okay, so their job was to make sure that Iran's belt, or whoever Iran can reach out to, gets the support Iran can reach, can give them. Okay. Now Iran has, I would say, mainly two circles, and with that I'll finish and we'll go to Q&A. The first circle are Shiites around the world, and more than anything else, the Shiites of Lebanon, okay, because they're more vulnerable than other Shiites. But as you know, Soleimani's name actually became famous because of some I would say, covered journeys of his to Iraq, and the fact that he spent time there with some militias after the American invasion, and especially in recent years. So that is one important way Iran sees the region, as the place where Shiites should make a more significant voice, have some more significant voice, be a more significant. And Iran is the flagship of Shiite Islam. Okay, that's also what puts it into a collision course with Saudi Arabia, which is a flagship of Sunni Islam. Okay, so these two Islams, we spoke about them last week, and some about their animosity, hostility. Okay. Now, at the same time, and with that I'll finish, it doesn't mean Iran rules out reaching out to non-Shiites in the region. It actually makes a lot of efforts to reach out to Sunnis whenever that would leverage Iran's position in the region. And here Iran is more picky compared to its relation to Shiites. In other words, for example, Gaza Strip. Okay, so Iran and Gaza share an enemy. It happens to be us, by the way. And so then Iran has a great leverage in, reaching out to Gaza, sending weapons, sending money, etc. It does not mean Iran is turning any more Sunni or any closer to Sunni Islam. Actually, it's the other way around. When Iran sends support, it often tries, delicately if it can, and more vociferously if it can do that as well, to send dua or proselytizers who would try to convert the population to Shiite Islam. It's been doing a very good job in this sense in recent months in Syria, actually couple of years now in Syria, where Syria is becoming more a Shiite than it had been in the past. Okay, so I left a lot uncovered, and I will switch to Q&A now, and we'll see where you want to take this.
Okay, thank you very much, Menahem. So there's a bunch of questions about some specific issues. Before we get to them, I want to ask a broader question, which is, a lot of the sort of let's say non-expert, non-scholarly expert news or information that we get about Iran is in the context of its hostility towards Israel, and B, more broadly, what seems to be a very, let's say, imperial strategy in the wider Middle East, right? So, one way of looking at it could be to say, if you look all around the Middle East where there's conflicts, Iran has its hand there, right? Whether it's Hamas in Gaza, or Hezbollah in Lebanon, or supporting Assad in Syria, or the Houthis in Yemen, or of course in Iraq, where it's backing Shia militia. what's your take on Iran's wider strategy in the region?
Okay. I have an idea. Paul, do you want to take a few questions?
Sure. Sure. So let me. Okay. Sure. Okay. So let's put that one on the table, as well as. I mean, there was one specific question about the origin. What's the origin of the regime's hostility towards Israel? Okay. And the question asked whether it's connected to Israel's previous friendly relationship with the regime of the Shah. A different question is about the Baha'is in Iran, a very persecuted minority. Why are they persecuted, essentially, is the question. Maybe we'll start with those.
Sure, yes. So Israel. Yes, so I would say it has two, I could think of three layers or three directions to think of Iran's hatred to Israel. I'll start with the simple one. There's anti-Semitism in Iran. It's as simple as that. And I don't know how many of you are aware of it, but anti-Jewish feelings are not that rare in the region in general. Of course, when I'm talking about the Palestinian context, I don't think of it in that way, because there's a very a tangible conflict here. So I'm not talking about that, but the hatred of Jews is not that random. And actually, when I think of Iran, it is more of the classical anti-Semitism you might know from European history, for that matter. Okay, it's not that different in a sense. Okay, and it has to do a little bit, and I will not go too deep into that, but Iranians in that period of the Shah, and even before him in the time of his father, Iranians absorbed the Aryan notion that Iranians are Aryan in origin. They are descendants of the Aryan tribes. And the Aryan myth, as we sometimes call it in European history, got a very well receiving end in Iran. So much so that during the Holocaust, when Iranian Jews were caught in Europe, in France specifically, it happened a few times when they went to visit relatives or they just happened to be there. I even saw some very interesting documents of Nazis thinking about, are these people Aryan or are they Jewish? What takes more, the fact that they are Iranian or the fact that they're Jewish? So yeah, it sounds very odd, but anyway, the Aryan myth is one level. The second level has to do with the recent history, modern history, the fact that Israel was tied or had good ties with the Shah. Everything tied to Mohammad Reza Shah is blasphemy, is anathema in the eyes of the people who led the revolution. Okay, not just clerics, by the way, also many of these socialists and Marxists. Okay, the Shah, again, epitomized everything they hate in Iran and in the modern world, and Israel had ties with it. Okay, so that's the second, that's the second answer, and the third answer is a little more, has to do with the geostrategy and Iranian interests. Hating Israel is a very cheap card to play and to leverage to get popularity in the Arab world. And the Arab world is something that Iran has been grappling with, and how to become more popular there. Again, because majority of this world is Sunni, because Iran has, I don't think of it as empirical, but it definitely has some regional aspirations, and that world, or parts of this world, are very much intimidated by Iranian ideas and Iranian aspirations. And hating Israel is just, for example, it's the easiest thing to be a Lebanese patriot by hating Israel. It's much easier, and it doesn't cost much to hate Israel. After all, Iran doesn't, put a lot of money into it by measures of its own size. So I'm just saying it's a third explanation. Okay. Now something about Iran's imperial aspirations. So I said, I kind of, I'm a little averse to this to way of putting it, because it's not that Iran wants to conquer the region, even though it sometimes seems that way when you look at the news. Iran, by the way, notice that Iran almost never sends its soldiers to fight outside its borders, with very few exceptions. It's true. In Syria was a big exception, Iraq, but in Iraq the numbers were very small. And even in these two countries, Iran more often than not sends others, non-Iranians, to fight. It would rather do that than send Iranians to fight. So Iran's aspirations is the way, and now I'm going to step into the shoes and into the to the worldview of the people who make decisions in Iran. The way they put it is, we want a more friendly region, and we will do anything possible to make that happen. So, in other words, you know, they would say, and again, I hope you're okay with this stepping into their shoes. What different is that from the way Israel, you know, is having its lobby and tries to leverage whatever power Jews have around the world to promote its causes? So we promote Shiite causes. That's our, you know, that's our raison d'etre. Why not do that? So whenever we have, wherever we have people who would you know, reach out to us, we reach out to them, and we will be their big, you know, loving Shiite mother. And that's what Iran does. And if they need protection, who would protect them if not we in Iran? So if Shiites of Lebanon are downtrodden and are, you know, are often neglected, then who would take care of them if not the big Shiite country of Iran? Okay, it's not imperialism. We don't try to conquer it. We just try to make the place more balanced, because American and you know, an Israeli influence is way too high. About the Baha'is, yes, the Baha'is, unlike Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians, surprisingly, they're not considered a legitimate religion. Okay, because, and that has to do mainly with the fact that it's a modern faith. And it stemmed out from Shiism. You know, Baha'ism started in Iran in the 19th century, in the 1840s. That's in Shiraz. That's where it started. And the fact that the Baha'is, you know, again, it's not that uniquely Shiite or Iranian. The fact that religions are more suspicious than offshoots of their own than anything else. You know, other religions is something, you know, they're ancient, you know, they're around, you know, they're worldview to that degree or another. But Baha'ism stemmed out as some kind of a Shiite heresy. And it spoke the language of Shiite Islam, and yet it introduced some very, you know, revolutionary or novel ideas. And to make things worse, it sprang out, or it appeared in a period of very deep changes in Iran, changes that often included modernist ideas and growing foreign influence. So the Baha'is, to top it all, are also considered to be some remains or some legacy of foreign influence in Iran. Okay, I'm not saying it's true. I'm just saying that's the way they've been depicted in Shiite circles. And just one more thing about the Baha'is, it's not just Islamic Republic that has been repressing them. Actually, the Shah even took part in that. In '54, he kind of looked the other way, or ordered the police to look the other way when a specific group called Hujjatiyya, it doesn't matter, a specific Islamic school in Iran, actually had a pogrom against Baha'is. And so the Baha'is are really the ultimate scapegoats in Iran. But there's still a small community there.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. You talked about the parallel systems, right? The elected system of the president and the parliament, and the system headed by the leader, the supreme leader. Yeah. When we hear about things like the nuclear program, or the intention to ensure that President Assad stays in power in Syria, and all these things that worry Israelis, are these things that are pushed by this or that president and could therefore be changed with a different president when his 4-year term comes to an end? Or is these things that are pushed by the supreme leader, by Khomeini, and are not going to change until he dies, or maybe not even then?
Right. Okay. Should I take more, or should I?
Maybe just go with. I think there could be quite a lot there. So.
Okay. Sure. So okay, I'll address that, and then we'll move on with the others.
Sure.
So yes. So the way, again, this is not exactly clear how it should work, but the way things did work, and again, don't forget that Iran has quite a short history. The Islamic Republic of Iran, I mean, has quite a short history. It's only 42 years in existence, okay? And what that means is that, for example, they never really had a supreme leader elected the way one should. What happened is that when Khomeini died, Khomeini was kind of, there was a poll over his election, it was kind of a referendum, and it was almost automatic. And then he actually chose Khamenei, and Khamenei, there was no referendum for Khamenei, it was kind of a special assembly that, that decided over it. In essence, the way it should happen is that, and when Khamenei dies, we'll know whether it's going to work the way it should, is that the supreme leader is elected by, it's really a little bit like the Vatican style, kind of a body of cardinals like Ayatollahs who elect the next supreme leader. Now, the way, so what I've started with this in order to explain that it's not clear from the Constitution to what degree is a supreme leader, for example, involved in everyday politics and everyday running of the state, running of affairs. But the way, the way Khamenei has led things, and because he's such a talented and I wouldn't even say conniving kind of politician, is that he's very much involved. So in other words, he uses the president to be, I would say, the window or the the outward, the facade for Iran's foreign policy. So if he wants an agreement over the nuclear program, he said, he would let a president elected that, but it is what the people wanted. I'm not saying it's not, but he could have derailed the process from moving to an agreement, for example, if the supreme leader wouldn't want it. So to try to reach a conclusion is that, yes, in Khamenei's time, Khamenei has the last word. However, it doesn't mean that he doesn't listen to voices from from out there. For example, the fact that he allowed, he didn't give a blessing, but he allowed the nuclear deal to happen in 2015. That shows you that he listens to voices from below. And even though it's true that the president's, I would say, role in, for example, enhancing or stopping a nuclear program is very limited. I'm not saying he doesn't have any voice, because the supreme leader would want to hear his advice, and he listens to him. But it's just an advice. After all, he has the last word. Okay, but I will just add to that nuclear thing one more sentence, and that is that during the years, especially the years of the high sanctions in Obama's time, early Obama period, there was the community of scholars, I would say, over Iran was divided into two over the question of how rational is Iran, and I kind of happen to belong to the camp that says it's rational. I think Iran is a rational country, it thinks rationally, it has rational decisions, which means it's not going to get a bomb if it thinks it's going to hurt it dramatically, and it's not going to use that bomb even if it had one, if it thinks its interests would be undermined. And I think leaders of Iran are rational enough to know that if they even think of using such a weapon, if they had one, that might mean the end of the short history of that republic. So I think they're not stupid enough to do anything in that direction. Doesn't mean that it doesn't pose other threats to the region, and it doesn't mean it's not a threat. I'm just saying it is not a completely irrational actor as sometimes they think of it out there.
Okay, so I'm going to follow up that last point about the regime acting rationally and not, as you said, not doing anything that might spell its own demise. We have a question about how sustainable is the current regime given the challenges it faces, and I assume that means both external challenges and perhaps also internal challenges given some of the protests that there have been in Iran recently. How do you see it eventually falling, if you do, and what could replace it?
Okay, that's an easy one. It's quite sustainable. I know the economic situation is bad. Iran is under serious strains, and with the corona to top it off, it's really bad. And yet I don't see any serious threat over the regime. For one thing, something like the corona, it weakens everybody, including the opposition. But Iran's opposition main problem is not the corona. Iran's main problem with the opposition, and whenever people take to the streets, media talks about the prospects for a revolution in Iran, and I'm more often than not, I'm amused by this kind of talk, because it's often done by people who don't really know this country well to understand that the opposition in Iran is comprised of different sectors of society that don't see eye to eye, that will not be able, or it will be very hard for them to cooperate or to join hands into any joint act against the state. Okay, so for one thing, the state has a lot of people on, by its table. The Revolutionary Guards and the largest circles of people who work for the government are a bunch of million people. It's not just a couple of thousands or so. Okay, Iran is much less centralized than it was in the time of the Shah. Okay, so it's decentralized. There's more than one base of power in the country. It's not just a supreme leader and a close circle of his aides or something like that. It's much, much more than that. And now to get to the opposition. So the opposition, the last time Iran had a serious opposition, okay, and it wasn't an opposition to the state system, by the way, it was an opposition to specific leadership and specific elections that were rigged, and they were. But that was in 2009. The second term of Ahmadinejad that was rigged, okay? But what the country did with this opposition turned out to be very wise. And that was to isolate its leadership and to create a certain chasm or I would say gap between them and the masses. And they did it quite wisely, I would say, quite effectively. Okay, so when you see opposition in Iran in recent years, we can speak about three different types of opposition. Okay, mainly two. One is the youth, the people who want freedom, women who want to dress as they like and not to be told how to cover their heads, etc., etc. That is one type of opposition. Okay, and that is, I would say, relatively speaking, not so many people. As much as this country is quite young in average, my guess would be a couple of 100,000 Iranians are really bothered by these kind of freedoms, because it's not that the rest like limitations. It's just that because for the most part in Iran, in the Islamic Republic of Iran, you can run your way of life in many ways as you want if you don't antagonize the system. Okay. So as much as there's, yes, the banning of taking off the headscarf of women, there's parties of boys and girls together. And there's a whole underworld of other things that happen at the same time. And if I know where they happen, the Islamic Republic definitely knows where they happen. And they turn a blind eye. It's not a totalitarian state. It's not a totalitarian country. It's a country where the state knows how to look the other way often about those kind of things. The second reason, the second group, okay, are the workers, the blue collar, and they run kind of protests that are very mundane and uninteresting, un-Iranian, if you like, about wages and about work conditions, et cetera, et cetera. They have very little in common with those youth. Many of them are very, very traditional, very conservative in their way of life. They don't necessarily see eye to eye with those. And there's a third type of opposition which you actually don't hear about outside of Iran. The least known type of opposition, because it involves not so many people, but it's a very significant one for any future, well, hopes, if you like, for a change, a great change of the system. And that is the clerics. There are many clerics and many people in madrasas who don't like the system. Because what happened is that when and that has to do with the legacy of the revolution. The revolution said, pretty much, or its legacy is that the religion runs the state, okay, or men of religion. But then, of course, the question arises, what men of religion run the state? It can't be everybody, right? So, and what happened in the effect is that the state runs religion. Because if if the highest ranking person is to run the state, then the person who's running the state, by definition, is the highest ranking cleric, even if he's not such a great learned man. And that's exactly the case of Khomeini. Khomeini is not even half as learned as Khomeini was. If there's any way of measuring these things. okay? He is not a very learned cleric. He was actually kind of a middle to low class type of student who became a full-time professor overnight to become the supreme leader of Iran. Then you can imagine if that happened in the college or university you went to, what other professors think of such a professor, right? Who became one because the president wanted him to become one. And that's exactly what happened with Khomeini. So the clerics actually have a lot in their belly, at least some of them, against the system and against Khomeini. And they would be very happy to see this system changed, but they don't dare speak now because they're under the closest monitoring, actually, of the state Khomeini is running. So these three groups actually don't seem to be able to cooperate.
Great. Okay. We have time for a few more questions, I think, if that's okay with you. We have a question. We had a question about the. It takes us back to the beginning of your talk when you were looking at the demography of the country and the Arab minority. The question was, what is the extent of exploitation by the regime of these Arab citizens and their regions, particularly with regard to the oil wealth in those regions?
So, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I just plugged in. Okay. So the extent of exploitation, it's quite bad. The population in the southern part of Iran, the Arabs, people of Arab origins, and the people, Kurds to a less degree, I would say, or at least they complain less. But people on the borders with Pakistan, what I showed you, Luristan, and that area, the borders with Pakistan, Luris, Baluchis, they are the ones who are in the worst condition. First of all, because as I said, they are an overlapping minority. They're ethnically and religious-wise, they're a minority. They're often Sunnis. That's one reason. The second reason is that these places are remote from the center, and they also border with countries that Iran has pretty bad relations with, especially in the south, the Arabs of the south. And that together puts them in a very, again, often being suspected as a fifth column. We often have riots in these areas. So the area that borders with Pakistan actually has armed militias that roam around the place, and every once in a while, again, these kind of things never make it to the news in the West, I guess, but every once in a while there's a government official who's attacked there or killed, there's an attack on a mosque, etc. In the South, it's more like riots that might remind you of riots of people of color in the States, that masses take to the streets and demonstrate against the bad conditions they live in, and about the about the harsh, for example, the harsher measures of the police against them, etc., etc. There's also some bad blood, some historical bad blood between, especially with Arabs and the state, because, for example, I'll give you an example. In the 1980s, there was a war between Iran and Iraq, right? The famous Iran-Iraq War, 80 to 88, a horrible war that left a whole generation of Iranians and Iraqis actually in the grave. So that war obviously was started by Iraq invading into Iran, and obviously that would be, invading first of all to Khuzestan, to that area where Arabs live. And people in the region, we know by many memoirs, for example, that they wrote, they felt that people in Tehran don't care about them being butchered by Saddam's army because these are Arabs who are killing Arabs. Why would Tehran care about that? Even though it's its own citizens, right? So, and there was also a certain expectation in Iraq that these people might join the Iraqi army, which did not happen, by the way. And to top it all, they suffered the worst because they were the first part that the Iraqi army went through to invade the rest of the country. So yes, so to answer your question, yes, there's reason for bad blood between some of these groups. With others, it's more, I would say it's much more light. For example, the Azeris, with the Azeris, it's often a struggle over school textbooks. Can Azeris teach in Azeri in school? Or Iran often, doesn't like the fact that many Azeris want to listen to a radio from Turkey or Azerbaijan from across the border. So it kind of creates all kinds of measures to prevent them from actually being able to listen to these, to radio or television from there, which doesn't actually work so well. So because they do. So anyway, with Azeris, it's easier.
Okay. All right. I think we have one more question, which is quite a on a pretty serious topic. I think there was an article recently by the American scholar and policy analyst Michael Duran about the partnership of China and Iran, of an investment that China is making in Iran. And the thesis of this piece was that saying that Iran would serve as a military sword to further Chinese anti-Western interests in return for a massive long-term investment. Do you see this as an effort that will lead to greater military incursions, especially ones that could threaten Israel?
No, I don't think it gives Iran, what it gives Iran is a lifeline, definitely. And that's the way it was presented to Iranians. If it makes it any easier for any of you, some Iranians are very concerned about this connection. And I'm talking about very patriotic Iranians, because actually for the same reason that some Israelis were concerned and some others around the world, that the Chinese seem to be buying them out and controlling their infrastructure in the next decades. And they said, how could we sell, the Chinese the rights to build ports, etc. Sounds familiar, right? But I think it's a lifeline for Iran, because Iran is quite, isolated in the world arena. And again, unlike what the way Iran is depicted or the way we imagine it to be, like this giant country that's going to swallow the region, the way Iran sees itself, if I step into the shoes of its decision makers, we are surrounded by enemies. We're a big country, it's true. We should be actually bigger even. But we're surrounded by enemies, and all over wherever we look right and left, we have the Americans and their allies in the region: Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the Gulf, some of the Emirates, Iraq. Well, Iraq, some of it, part of it. And we have Israel, of course, and Lebanon is a little, skittish about our relations with our Shiite population, et cetera, et cetera. So. We should reach out again. It's this reaching out and this feeling lonely, if you like, in the region. And it's a very strong economic interest, because Iran has very few countries that would be willing to invest in it in recent times. So China, and so that's a cold partnership. There's nothing very deeply ideological about this partnership on both sides, by the way, of this. And yes, both are, I would say, quite averse to American, especially, the Trump administration policy and spirit. So yes, they do see it's some sort of leverage against that. But I wouldn't make too much of it as if Iran is going to swallow the world like China is, or anything like that.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I hope everyone found that as informative and as enlightening as I did. And we thank Dr. Merhavy again, and we'll be back next week when we'll look at the events of the Arab Spring of 2011 and its aftermath and the effects that we're still feeling today, of course. And thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Paul. Bye-bye.